Hello and welcome to Watercolour Wednesday with me, Rebecca Jarman. Thank you for being here today. I'm really grateful to have you. In today's class we're going to be painting these really beautiful pink tulips. So a free resource that I'm including in today's class is a downloadable PDF for you to print at home, and then you can join me in painting them today. So let's get started. Today's class you're going to need the reference image that you can download. If you have a look underneath this video, there's a link to this in the description. Download and print it off at home, and then you can use it to transfer the reference image onto your watercolour paper. So that's the first thing you're going to want to do. You're also going to need a HB pencil, a graphite stick. Those are going to be used to transfer your image. You want some masking tape, a sheet of watercolour paper, a drawing board as well of some kind to stick your paper down to, then a selection of watercolour brushes. I have a small, medium and large round watercolour brush, a pot of water to keep clean to use for mixing your paints, and a pot for cleaning your brush in. You're going to need your palette and paints, and I also have a cloth to wipe my paintbrushes on too. So once you've gathered all your materials, we can get started. So as you can see, I've already stuck my paper down to the board using masking tape on all four sides, and I have already transferred my drawing down to the watercolour paper. Now I've got a video, I'll link that below in the description box, and it'll show you, if you watch that, you can see step-by-step instructions on how to transfer your reference image to the watercolour paper. But you can see I have scribbled with the graphite on the back, I've placed it over the top of the paper, secured it with a little bit of tape in the corner, and then traced around the images. So once you are at that stage, we can get started. So I have placed my flowers in the bottom left corner, and I may well need to bring some of these lines right down to the bottom. They are cut off slightly, so just extend them until you reach the masking tape, and that way the image is going to make sense, and the same up on the left here as well. So I've just extended those few lines that weren't all the way down to my tape. And the colours we're going to use today are, to mix the green of the foliage and the stems, we're going to use cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue. And then actually I'm moving away from my primaries a little bit today. I'm going to use some of my permanent rose, which is here in my palette. So we've got magenta and permanent rose there, and we'll have a look to see which one's best to use for that. Okay. So I've got a tester strip, which is just a scrap of watercolour paper here. I'm going to test those two colours and see which one's most suitable for this painting. So I'm just going to wet my brush and start by picking up some of this magenta. This is quinacridone magenta, and let's have a look at that. That's really nice. It's got sort of a blue tinge to it. Clean off my brush there, and then I'm going to pick up some of the permanent rose. Let's have a look. I've got a feeling the permanent rose is going to be, yeah, it's just a nice lovely pink colour, which I think is more suitable for these particular tulips. So if I show you those two together, you can see either of those colours would work, but I'm happy with the permanent rose, so that's what I'm going to use. I also may pop in a little bit of the cadmium red as well. So let's have a look at that. Let's just pop a bit of cadmium red on my palette. So the cadmium red's got quite a lot of yellow in it. It's our warm red in the palette. And then I'm going to add in some of the permanent rose. And it's just going to give us a much more red colour. And I think that's going to work in some of the areas nicely too. So, and then if I just show you quickly, so we'll start with the cadmium yellow and we'll mix the green that we're going to use. So always start off, because this is quite a light green, you want to start off with the yellow first because that's the lighter colour of the mix. The blue's a lot stronger, therefore you'll only need a little bit of the ultramarine blue and it changes that yellow immediately. So we're going to want a nice yellow green for, got a hair there, let's get rid of that. Doesn't want to come off. So that is a lovely yellow green and that's going to be perfect for the stems of the tulips. And we're also going to want a dark green mix as well. So let's do that over the other side. So again, starting with the cadmium yellow and then into that. This time, because we're making a darker blue, we want more, darker green, excuse me, we want more of the ultramarine blue and that will give us a darker green. So it's always best to add your colours bit by bit until you get the correct tone that you want, the correct shade that you want. So that looks pretty good to me. So we've got some of the darker tones there. We've got the lovely permanent rose and the permanent rose mixed with some of the cadmium red as well. And those are the colours I'm going to use. So I'll keep that to one side. Now I'm happy with that, we can get started. So hopefully you've already transferred your image onto your watercolour paper. And let's see, so what I'm going to do first of all is put a pale wash of the permanent rose all the way over the tulips. So I'm going to mix up a good amount of the permanent rose on my palette. And we want a fairly pale mix. There we go, that's nice. So you can see some of the white of the paper shining through. So it's not thick, it's got quite a lot of water in it. And to allow myself time to paint this down, I'm going to take another brush with clean water and I am going to wet the area of the petals. So I'm going to paint a wash across the entire flower, so don't worry about the individual petals at this time. Hopefully your tracing is dark enough that you'll still see your lines beneath. So we're going to paint a wash over the entire area of the flower. So just be careful where you are putting this water down, because anywhere this water goes, the paint that you put down next will want to run into the water. So if you get it on the leaves, you'll probably find that you'll end up with pink leaves. So just take your time with that, and then you want to use a fairly large brush because it's quite a large area to cover. I'm using a number 8, and then we can just get that pink wash down. And because we've pre-wet the paper, it lightens the colour slightly, and also you will find that the once the paint has dried on the paper, it lightens quite a bit, up to 30% lighter than it is when it's wet. So just take that into consideration when you're mixing your colours. It's always a good idea to test them on a piece of paper like I have, and then actually wait for it to dry, and you'll be happy. Then you'll know exactly what colour you're going to end up with once it's dry. So that's my first flower painted in. I'm going to continue doing exactly the same thing for the other two tulips. Okay, so while they're drying, I've just noticed that down here I've actually gone over my line a little bit with the paint, so it's a great chance for me to give you another little tip. So I've got a flat, very cheap, hard, firm bristle brush, so this is probably best for acrylic painting. It's very cheap. You just want to wet the bristles and take a little bit of clean kitchen paper, and you rub at that edge with those wet bristles and immediately dab off with the clean paper towel. And as you can see there, you can quickly remove anywhere that needs addressing. So that's slightly over my line, so this is a good chance to just tidy up some edges if you need to. If you're using a round brush, it might take 2 or 3 attempts to lift because the bristles are softer, and I just find that these flat brushes are much more effective at removing the paint. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't work with everything, because if you are using, for example, alizarin crimson, it's a staining pigment, so therefore it'd be very difficult to lift that. But for the vast majority of other paints, certainly the 6 that I recommend in my palette, they're all pretty good at lifting, apart from the crimson. So yeah, give that a go if you happen to have gone across some of your lines. Now I'm happy that that's all nice and tidy, and actually my flowers are dry enough for me to show you the next step. So what I'm going to do next is paint in the stems of the tulips, and you can see, if we go back to the tester strip, you can see that it's quite a nice light zingy green. It's like, I like to call it an apple green, so there's a lot of yellow in that, and we pre-mixed it earlier, so I'm happy to just use what we've got on the palette already, taking a smaller brush this time. So this one is a number 4, and an area like this, for example, at the top is quite small, so I could probably get away with just working on dry paper without having to pre-wet with water, because you can quickly fill that space without getting any hard edges. So I'm happy to fill that one in. However, when it comes to this stem and this stem, they're much longer and it will take longer to paint. So I would just recommend, especially as a beginner, take your time by first of all wetting that area with some clean water, carefully filling in the space. Remember, at the edges, be careful, because anywhere you put this water down, your green paint will run into. So just take your time with that. Switch back to your smaller brush, pick up some of that green, and then paint it in. And that way you're going to prevent any hard lines from occurring in your wash. What happens, hard lines form when wet paint touches dry paint or slightly damp paint. Because they're going to dry at a different rate, you end up with these hard lines. So this is just a really easy way of preventing that. So finally, in this last stem, exactly the same thing. If you're using a round brush, you can go for a slightly larger brush when you're wetting because it holds a lot more water, but because it's a round brush, it has a nice tip. That means that even though there's some little nooks and crannies, I can get into those shapes quite easily with a round brush. So I'm going into the paint now with my smaller brush and then laying that green down. So the left hand edge of this stem has a slightly darker, sort of got a shadow on the left hand side. So I'm going to go into the darker paint that I mixed earlier. Just pick up a little bit of that dark green. And while it's damp, I'm going to draw that down the left hand side of the stem, and it will mix with the light green and blend really nicely on the surface of the paper. And you get that little shadow line there and a nice soft transition between light and dark. Now these two stems have already dried, so I couldn't go back now and do that. If I did, I'd get a really hard line. If you can see here, if I lift up my picture, you should be able to see here that the transition is really soft. If I show you on a tester strip, if I were to put my dark green down on top of this green, if you imagine that's the stem, it's already dried. If I were to come on the left hand side now and paint a line, can you see how crisp and sharp that line is? So that's what we call a hard edge. And it's quite a graphic kind of way of painting, but when you're trying to create a sort of a more realistic, softer kind of painting, you want to be working wet in wet. So it's quite simple. We just take our wetting brush with, again, clean water, and just pop a little bit down across that stem. And then with the darker green, you can go into that water now and it will soften the edge. There we go. So just popping that in down the side there, creating that shadow. And if I look at the reference image, the top stem here, the tallest tulip, I'll wet that, and actually it's quite dark. The whole thing is sort of in shadow, so I'm going to pop quite a lot of that green down, especially underneath the top edge and down the left hand side there. Again, we've got quite a soft transition between light and dark. Okay, so that's that step done. So the stems are completed now. The next step would be to look again at the tulips themselves. Okay, so now looking at the tulip flower heads again, if I bring across the reference image and we take a look at the top flower, you can see that there are lights and darks, and we have a good pink base to begin with. Now we need to actually give it some definition. So looking at the tester strip, we're going to be using this kind of shade of the mix of the pink with the red. So let's just pop that to one side. And on my palette, clean off my brush first. Make sure you're using clean brush, because if you mix any green with this pink, you'll get brown, so you'll make a muddy colour. So starting off with a nice clean brush, I'm going to just pop some more water in that mix because it had had time to dry on the palette. So let's go again. Start with some permanent rose, picking up some permanent rose on my brush. And then I'm going to add a little of that cadmium red. There we go. Okay, so I'm quite happy with that colour. If I touch it if I actually overlay it, that was the colour that we used to apply for the petals initially. If you overlay that, you can see that creates a really nice colour. So what we want to do now is, again, we want to wet this entire area and just lay the darker paint in the places that we want, and then that way the edges will be softened. So taking my wetting brush, my large wetting brush, and you can work in small areas. You don't have to sort of wet the whole thing in one go. So let's have a look. So I'm going to begin with the very top edge of the very top right hand petal, and that's actually all quite dark. So rather than, because it's quite a small area as well, rather than wetting that, I'm actually going to take my brush and just fill that in on the dry paper, because we've got hard edges around that shape and we don't want it to affect the petals that are next to it. So I've gone onto the dry paper and just to fill in that small space there. So that's a much better colour now, and it's a really good strength as well. So much more red, and it resembles the reference image. Now don't worry too much about the reference image. Use it as a guide, but it doesn't have to be perfect. Your painting isn't going to be displayed next to a printout of the reference image, so just bear that in mind as well. Use it as a guide, just as a reference to compare where you want these lights and darks. So now I've painted that section, what I won't do is paint anything that's touching that, because what I put down next to it will run into that wash. So I have to allow that to fully dry before I can paint up to those edges. Therefore, I'm going to come to the left hand petal and paint that first. Now this time I am going to wet the area because I want to leave some of the areas lighter. So I'm going to wet it first because it's quite a large shape and I won't be able to fill that out too quickly. So just with a damp brush, actually I'm going to take a little bit of water off there. There was quite a lot. Try and control the amount of water, excuse me, that's going down onto the page. You don't want puddles, so just check from the side. If you look from the side, you should be able to see a nice sheen on the surface of the paper. So now I'm going to fill my brush, load my brush, and I want to apply this darker shade anywhere that I can see it on the reference image. So there's a nice dark line running down that shape and it sort of spreads down to the bottom. And then there's also a bit of a shadow line running along that edge where the one petal overlaps it. So if I run my paintbrush down there, that's lovely. Okay, and then while it's still wet, you can keep working, you can keep adding more paint. Just going to mix up a bit more. It's really nice and dark down this bottom section, so I'm just popping down more pigment down here so that it's nice and strong, and again down that shadow line on the right hand side. Okay, a bit darker up here as well. Yes, that's nice. So we've got some little soft transitions across that petal, which works well. So I'm going to give it a few minutes to dry, so I'll pop back to you in a second once this is dry and I can move on to the rest of the petals. Okay, so it's been about 5 minutes and it's had a chance to dry off. So I'm going to continue with this same colour, working first of all in the centre at the top to fill out that dark space right in the middle of the flower there, on dry paper because it's a small shape and it's got nice hard edges to it. We want to keep that nice and sharp. Now, working on the next section underneath, I'm going to paint in that shape again onto dry paper because again it's quite a sharp edge on that left side there, and I'm going to fill that out along that line. And then what happens is it gets to about here and then it gets nice and soft, so I'm just going to take that wet brush with water. I've added a little bit of water on the edge there, and that will just soften that up nicely, and it just fades out as we come across. So you can keep adding a bit more water just to fade that colour out. Okay, so that shape has gone from dark on the left hand side, gradually fading to that light pink that we had as a first wash on the right hand side. So we're starting to get 3 dimensions across the flower now, and I'm going to add another wash to the back section here that's left. I'm just going to water it down slightly so it's not quite as strong, so that there's a bit of separation between those 3 shapes. So this one's going to be a little bit paler, and just again putting it down on the dry paper so we can control where this paint goes and it's not going to spread anywhere we don't want it to go. There we go. So that's that top section done. So it just leaves us with this final large petal right at the front here, and it's really lovely. There's lots of lovely light pink, and then really the darks are predominantly at the bottom of the petal and down that left hand side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wet this area because it's a nice big area and there are quite a lot of lights. So I don't want the paint to be too thick and I don't want it to be too dark. So popping down the water is going to help prevent that from happening. And it's also going to mean that my job is a little bit easier because anywhere I put this next layer of paint down, it's just going to give me a soft edge. I won't need to blend out or anything like that. So I'm just popping the paint down. And it's running, you can see it wants to run into the water. So keep loading up your brush when you need to, coming down to the bottom of the petal. And then I'm going to flick up the surface of the petal and it will give me some sort of striations, some little thin lines, which is what we can see there. And so we've got a little bit of texture, we've got that strength of colour at the bottom, defining that shape. And it's all very, very soft because it's nice and wet. Okay, now I'm just going to strengthen my colour a bit, so a bit of fresh paint in the palette, a bit more red, a little bit more pink, and just strengthening this section here. And again, the paper's still wet, so it'll give me a soft edge, and it's blending into what I just popped down. But can you see how that defines the edge of that petal? Needed that strength of colour. Again, just bring some of that dark up the side and the front. And it softly blends into what we've got already there. So just going to drag my brush up from the bottom. Sort of curved lines, not dead straight, they're curved, following the shape of the petal. And because it's still damp, that will soften off as well. So those are the techniques that I will use to complete the other two flowers, and I will just speed up the process for you and you can watch and enjoy. Just a quick pause to thank you again for being here. If you haven't already subscribed, click the subscribe button below this video and also check the bell icon too, and that way you'll get a notification every time I upload another free watercolour tutorial. Also, every Wednesday I release a free video, my Back to Basics series, perfect for you beginners out there who want to master the art of watercolour painting. Now let's get back to the class. So I'm just going to add a few more details onto these tulip flowers now. I'm going to use my pink, which is the permanent rose, mixed with some of the red, so that's the cadmium red, and I'm mixing it very, very thickly with hardly any water, just a little bit of water on a brush, and it's a really, really thick consistency of paint. And I'm going to use the very tip of my brush to add in some of the darker lines that run across some of the petals. So it's just these finishing details that add those lovely little touches, you know. So just bringing in some really dark, thick paint, probably a little bit up here as well from the bottom upwards, just dragging the brush, sweeping it away. And there's a couple of little lines on the top here as well. So these are quite sort of fiddly, finicky little details that you don't have to add in actually. If you think you've got enough detail within yours already, then don't feel the need to do this little extra bit, but sometimes I think these finishing touches are what bring the whole thing together for me. We've also got some dark, you could add a little bit of the ultramarine blue. If I just take a tiny bit of ultramarine blue just to darken it, sort of turns it a little bit purple. I'm going to turn my board because I'm finding it a bit tricky to do this. So I'm turning my board so that I've got my wrist at a better angle for these marks. And I'm just flicking up in a curved way. So I'm going to come into this and just flick, flick, like that. And I'm going to darken the centre of this with some of that paint. Just to pull out the shape a little bit more. Let's just add a touch of water and blend it in to what I've got there so it didn't have a hard edge. So I've just added a touch of water on my brush. Let's really darken that up. So more of the permanent rose now. Get some depth to that. And I'm just going to water it down a little bit in my palette. So let's see. The edges of the petals are quite important. So, for example, this centre point here, it's important to have nice crisp edges to define that shape. So when you're working, of course, on dry paper, you immediately get a strong, hard line, and that's what gives the detail to the painting. And actually, I think I'm going to stop there because I'm in danger of fiddling. You're probably shouting at the screen saying, no more, stop. So knowing when to stop is really important in painting, and I think I'm happy with it. That's got enough detail now and the whole thing's come together nicely. So finally, what we're going to look at then, of course, are the leaves. And there's variations in green. So when we look at our tester strip, we had 2 greens pre-mixed on the palette. So I've used the lighter green already on the stems, and we're going to look at the slightly darker colours in the palette. So let's get some more paint going. So this was the lighter green. This was made, if you remember, with the cadmium yellow first of all. Add some more water. So we've got quite a bit of an area to cover, so make sure you mix yourself up enough paint in your palette. So I've got my cadmium yellow there, and into that I'm going to add a little bit of the blue, ultramarine blue. So that's a lighter green. And then hopefully you can see this still on the camera. Yes, you can. So this is the darker green here. So that's just more blue in the mix than there is yellow. Actually, I might just add a touch more yellow in there. Let's mix up some more of this darker green. So starting with the yellow, and again going for the blue. And there we go. So I've got a little bit more of that green mixed up there. So, and obviously blending the two together will give you another green. Adding more water will give you a slightly different colour green as well. And what we're going to do here is everything about these leaves are, you know, they're soft. There's no real hard lines in here, so nothing like these marks we've got on the petals. Very soft transitions across each leaf, and so we're going to do the wet in wet technique. So clean brush, oops, I've just popped my yellow brush in, my pink brush straight into my clean water, so that wasn't a good start. So bit of clean water on my brush here, and I'm just going to make a start with this leaf. So if I show you, I'll give you a demonstration on this leaf and then speed the whole thing up again for you, and hopefully you're getting on really well with your own paintings. If you have any questions, pop them in the comments section below the video and I will endeavour to answer them for you. So that leaf is now wet, and what I'm going to do is actually use this larger brush now, because it's quite a big leaf that I'm filling. So I've got my lighter green on my brush, and I'm going to fill that shape, the whole shape, with this pale green. So kind of an apple green, like golden delicious kind of green. So just be really careful around your petals, the edges of your petals, because you've got them finished now, you don't want to spoil them. So just be really careful around those. So that is that one green down. Now I'm going to switch brushes, and on my smaller brush I've added some of the dark, and I'm going to come across on the left hand side and paint in some of this darker green, and it blends in really nicely with that light green. And because it's wet, it does all the blending for me. Don't have to work too hard, just pop it down where you see it, and the two colours mix together on the surface really nicely. And that's really it. There is a nice dark section just here on the reference image, so I'm going to paint that in with my larger brush. So let me just take off that pale green there, if I can rescue some of that. Wash my brush, taking off that excess water, and I'm going to paint that in. Actually, it's quite big. Let's wet it first, but you don't want it too wet because you don't want to water down the dark green. You want a nice strong green, so just a little water, enough to just damp the paper slightly. Give yourself a little time to get the colour down before the paper dries. Okay, so into that dark green. So at the top here, and fill that in. And the same applies to the leaves. Don't go and paint a leaf right next to a leaf that you've just painted, because the two washes will want to mix together, and you'll lose the edges of shapes. They will come together. So just paint leaves that, so I've painted that one. This one down here is obviously in a completely different area, so I'm safe to do that. I'm not going to spoil any edges of shapes or anything like that, so just be mindful of that. I'm going to add some more ultramarine blue to my paintbrush and get some more blue into that down at the bottom and strengthen that green a little bit more. Because it's wet, I can do that nicely without worrying about it, and it's blended in on the surface of the paper. So I've effectively mixed that green on the surface of the paper rather than in my palette. I've also got a video on my channel which talks about mixing colours on the paper and mixing colours in the palette, and the different ways to do that, and what you can achieve from doing that and using that technique. So if you want to check that one out, if you're not entirely sure, have a look at that. So I will speed up the process again for you now and continue with my leaves. Okay, so I'm just going to let that dry and remove it from the board and have a chat to you in a second. So here's our finished tulips. I'm really pleased with this painting. Using the wet and wet technique to create soft transitions from dark pinks to light pinks across the petals, and the same from darks to light across the stems and the leaves as well. And then of course a little bit of detail with wet on dry too, just for the finishing touches. So thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed today's class. I would love to see your tulip paintings, so if you want to put a comment below this video and let me know how you've got on, or if you've got any questions at all about these particular techniques that we've used today, or any other watercolour related questions, I'd be happy to answer those. So leave your comments below the video, and I'll see you next week for another class.